In a courtroom where justice was supposed to be blind, one racist judge's decision destroyed an innocent black youth's life, only for fate to deliver a chilling reckoning 5 years later when his own daughter paid the ultimate price. In the heart of a bustling American city, where justice was supposed to be blind, but often wore tinted glasses, lived an ambitious yet deeply prejudiced judge named Harold Whittaker. Known for his stern demeanor and iron-fisted rulings, Judge Whittaker had earned a reputation as someone who didn't play around in court. However, beneath his polished robes and gavel lay a man whose worldview was clouded by racism and bias. While he prided himself on upholding the law, his decisions were frequently influenced by stereotypes rather than facts. One fateful day, a young black teenager named Marcus Johnson found himself standing before Judge Whittaker. Marcus, only 17 years old at the time, was accused of stealing a car, a crime he vehemently denied. The evidence against him was circumstantial at best, with no concrete proof tying him to the theft. Witnesses were unreliable, and even the prosecutor privately admitted that the case was weak. Yet, when Marcus stood in the courtroom, his fate rested not just on the flimsy evidence, but also on the color of his skin. Judge Whittaker barely glanced at the details of the case. Instead, he fixated on Marcus's appearance, his nervous demeanor, and the fact that he came from a low-income neighborhood. In his mind, these factors painted Marcus as guilty before any deliberation began. Without hesitation, Judge Whittaker sentenced Marcus to 5 years in juvenile detention, ignoring pleas from Marcus's family and defense attorney. It was a harsh punishment for a crime Marcus didn't commit, one that would haunt both him and those connected to the judge in ways no one could foresee. For Marcus, life inside the facility became a nightmare. Surrounded by older inmates and stripped of his freedom, the once hopeful teenager quickly learned how cruel the world could be. He spent countless nights questioning why he was there, replaying the trial in his head, and wondering if anyone truly believed in his innocence. Letters from his mother reminded him to stay strong, but they couldn't shield him from the harsh realities of incarceration. Meanwhile, outside the walls of the detention center, Marcus's story faded into obscurity. His community mourned his absence but felt powerless against a system stacked against them. Judge Whittaker, on the other hand, moved on with his life, secure in his belief that he had done what was necessary to protect society. What he failed to realize, however, was that every action has consequences, and karma is rarely kind. As Marcus served his unjust sentence, resentment simmered within him. Though he tried to focus on bettering himself through education programs offered at the facility, the anger never fully dissipated. He vowed silently that someday, somehow, justice would find its way back to him. Little did he know, fate had already begun weaving a web that would eventually ensnare the very person responsible for his suffering. 5 years had passed since Marcus Johnson walked out of juvenile detention, but the scars from his wrongful imprisonment lingered like an unhealed wound. While he struggled to rebuild his life, Judge Harold Whittaker continued to operate within the system that had enabled his prejudiced decisions. For years, Whittaker basked in the illusion of invincibility, believing himself untouchable both professionally and personally. But cracks were beginning to form in his carefully constructed world, cracks that would soon widen into chasms. Whittaker's career, once celebrated for its tough-on-crime approach, was now under scrutiny. Rumors about his unethical practices had begun circulating among legal circles long before they reached the public eye. Former colleagues whispered about cases where evidence seemed conveniently overlooked or manipulated to suit his agenda. A few brave attorneys filed complaints alleging bias in his rulings, particularly against defendants of color. These accusations initially fell on deaf ears. After all, Whittaker had powerful allies who dismissed such claims as sour grapes from those who disagreed with his methods. However, the murmurs grew louder over time, fueled by mounting dissatisfaction from marginalized communities who felt betrayed by the justice system. The first real blow came not from external forces, but from within Whittaker's own family. His daughter, Emily Whittaker had always been the apple of his eye, a bright, ambitious college student destined for success. Growing up in a privileged household insulated her from many of life's harsh realities. She moved through the world with a sense of entitlement born from her father's status and wealth. To Emily, consequences were something that happened to other people, not to someone like her. This dangerous mindset ultimately led to a catastrophic decision that shattered not only her life, but also her father's carefully curated legacy. One fateful night, Emily attended a party at a friend's house. Surrounded by peers equally intoxicated by alcohol and adolescent bravado, she made the reckless choice to drive home despite being well over the legal blood alcohol limit. Her impaired state rendered her unable to react quickly enough when another vehicle unexpectedly crossed her path. In a split second, Emily swerved, losing control of her car and colliding violently with a young man crossing the street. The impact was devastating. By the time paramedics arrived, the victim, just 20 years old, was pronounced dead at the scene. Panic consumed Emily in the aftermath of the accident. Fearing arrest and imprisonment, she fled the scene without checking on the injured pedestrian or calling for help. It wasn't until hours later, safely tucked away in her bedroom, that reality began to sink in. Guilt gnawed at her conscience, yet her fear of accountability outweighed any remorse she felt. When police identified her as the driver responsible for the hit and run, Emily turned to the one person she believed could save her, her father. Judge Whittaker's reaction upon hearing the news was a mix of shock, anger, and desperation. On one hand, he was furious with Emily for making such a reckless mistake. On the other, he couldn't bear the thought of his precious daughter facing the consequences of her actions. Determined to shield her from prison, Whittaker leveraged every ounce of influence he possessed. He called in favors from former colleagues, pressured prosecutors, and even threatened to expose political secrets if necessary. Within days, Emily was granted access to a diversion program designed for first-time offenders, a slap on the wrist compared to the severe penalties typically handed down for vehicular manslaughter and fleeing the scene of an accident. News of Emily's lenient sentence spread rapidly, igniting outrage across the city. Social media platforms exploded with posts condemning the blatant double standards at play. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs that read, "Justice for victim's name," and "No more double standards." Many drew parallels between Emily's case and others involving less affluent defendants who received far harsher punishments for similar crimes. Among the crowd stood Marcus Johnson, watching silently as the voices of dissent grew louder. For him, this moment represented more than just public fury. It symbolized an opportunity to shine a light on the systemic injustices he had endured firsthand. The backlash against Whittaker intensified as journalists dug deeper into his history. Investigative reporters uncovered a pattern of racial bias in his courtroom rulings, highlighting numerous cases where black defendants received disproportionately harsh sentences compared to their white counterparts. One particularly damning report revealed that Whittaker had consistently imposed maximum penalties on juveniles of color accused of nonviolent offenses, while showing leniency toward white offenders charged with equivalent crimes. Public opinion turned sharply against him, with calls for his removal from the bench growing louder each day. As the storm raged around him, Whittaker found himself increasingly isolated. Colleagues distanced themselves, fearing association with his tarnished reputation. Friends stopped returning his calls, unwilling to be dragged into the controversy. Even his wife, Margaret, expressed disappointment in his actions, questioning whether his obsession with power and control had blinded him to basic morality. For the first time in decades, Whittaker faced the possibility of losing everything he held dear. Emily, meanwhile, wrestled with her own demons. Though spared immediate punishment, the weight of her guilt became unbearable. Every news segment discussing the case reminded her of the life she had taken and the privilege that allowed her to escape true accountability. She began avoiding social events, retreating into solitude as shame consumed her. Eventually, she decided to distance herself from her father, Unable to reconcile his manipulative tactics with her growing awareness of systemic inequality. Seeking redemption, Emily volunteered at organizations advocating for criminal justice reform, hoping to make amends for her mistakes and honor the memory of the young man whose life she had ended. For Judge Whittaker, the unraveling of his world served as a bitter reminder of the consequences of unchecked prejudice and corruption. As disciplinary hearings loomed, he was forced to confront the ripple effects of his actions, not just on Marcus Johnson, but on countless others whose lives he had irrevocably altered. Stripped of his title and authority, Whittaker was left to grapple with the wreckage of his choices. Once a symbol of judicial integrity, he now stood as a cautionary tale of how unchecked bias can erode even the most revered institutions. In the end, Emily's case became a catalyst for change, sparking widespread conversations about privilege, accountability, and the need for equitable justice. Marcus, inspired by the renewed attention on his story, resolved to fight back against the system that had wronged him. With the support of activists and pro bono lawyers, he prepared to file a lawsuit seeking compensation for the years stolen from him. His courage reignited hope in communities weary of fighting for fairness, proving that resilience and determination could challenge even the most entrenched systems of oppression. And though Judge Whittaker's downfall marked the end of one chapter, it signaled the beginning of another, one defined by the pursuit of truth, equality, and justice for all. The fallout from Judge Whittaker's actions, both past and present, created a seismic shift in the community. What began as outrage over Emily's lenient sentence evolved into a broader reckoning with systemic injustice, a reckoning that placed Marcus Johnson at its center. For years, Marcus had carried the weight of his wrongful convictions silently, focusing on survival rather than vengeance. But now, fueled by public support and a growing movement for reform, he found himself standing at the precipice of something greater, an opportunity to reclaim not just his dignity, but also to demand accountability from those who had wronged him. With the help of pro bono lawyers inspired by his story, Marcus filed a lawsuit against Judge Whittaker and the judicial system that had failed him. The case argued that Marcus's imprisonment was a direct result of racial bias and prosecutorial misconduct, citing evidence uncovered during investigations into Whittaker's courtroom history. This included testimonies from former colleagues, attorneys, and even victims of Whittaker's rulings who recounted similar experiences of being unfairly targeted because of their race or socioeconomic status. The lawsuit quickly gained national attention, drawing headlines across major media outlets and sparking debates about the need for transparency and equity within the justice system. As Marcus's legal battle unfolded, public sentiment shifted decisively in his favor. Communities rallied around him, organizing marches, vigils, and fundraisers to support his fight for justice. Social media campaigns amplified his voice, turning hashtags like #JusticeForMarcus and #EndSystemicRacism into rallying cries for change. For many Americans, Marcus became more than just a victim. He symbolized resilience in the face of adversity and hope for a future where fairness could triumph over prejudice. His courage emboldened others to share their own stories of injustice, creating a groundswell of momentum for criminal justice reform. Meanwhile, Judge Whittaker faced mounting pressure from all sides. The disciplinary hearings convened to address allegations of misconduct revealed damning details about his career. Witnesses testified about cases where Whittaker had ignored exculpatory evidence, pressured juries, and manipulated sentencing guidelines to disproportionately punish black defendants. One particularly damning revelation involved a memo circulated among prosecutors advising them to avoid assigning high-profile cases to Whittaker due to concerns about his impartiality. These revelations painted a picture of a man whose biases had infected every aspect of his professional life, leaving a trail of ruined lives in his wake. Public opinion turned sharply against Whittaker, culminating in calls for his disbarment and removal from the bench. Once revered as a pillar of authority, he was now vilified as a symbol of everything wrong with the justice system. Protesters gathered outside his home, holding signs that read, "Your bias destroyed lives," and no justice without accountability. News outlets dissected his fall from grace, portraying him as a cautionary tale of how unchecked power and prejudice can corrupt even the most respected institutions. By the time the disciplinary board issued its final ruling, stripping Whittaker of his title and barring him from practicing law ever again, his reputation lay in tatters. For Emily Whittaker, her father's disgrace served as a painful reckoning. Though spared immediate punishment thanks to her father's intervention, she bore the emotional scars of her actions. Nightmares plagued her sleep, replaying the moment of impact and the lifeless body lying crumpled on the pavement. Guilt consumed her, compounded by the knowledge that her privilege had allowed her to evade true accountability, while countless others faced far harsher consequences for lesser crimes. Unable to reconcile her father's manipulative tactics with her growing awareness of systemic inequality, Emily distanced herself from him emotionally and physically. Determined to make amends, Emily threw herself into volunteer work, dedicating her time to organizations advocating for criminal justice reform. She worked tirelessly to educate others about the dangers of unchecked privilege and the importance of equitable treatment under the law. Her efforts earned her praise from activists and critics alike, though she remained haunted by the knowledge that no amount of good deeds could bring back the life she had taken. In interviews, she spoke candidly about her guilt and the lessons she had learned, urging others to confront their own biases and recognize the humanity in everyone they encountered. Marcus's lawsuit ultimately succeeded, resulting in a substantial settlement that provided him with financial compensation for the years stolen from him. More importantly, it paved the way for policy changes aimed at addressing racial disparities within the justice system. Legislators introduced bills mandating implicit bias training for judges and attorneys, increasing oversight of prosecutorial practices, and establishing independent review boards to investigate claims of misconduct. While these measures were only the first steps toward meaningful reform, they represented a significant victory for communities long marginalized by systemic racism. For Marcus, the settlement marked the beginning of a new chapter. With the resources to pursue his dreams, he enrolled in college, determined to earn the engineering degree he had once thought lost forever. His journey inspired countless others, proving that resilience and determination could overcome even the most daunting obstacles. He became a vocal advocate for criminal justice reform, using his platform to amplify the voices of those still fighting for justice. Speaking at rallies and conferences, he urged audiences never to lose sight of the humanity behind statistics and headlines, to remember that every case represented a life irrevocably changed by the decisions of those in power. In stark contrast, Judge Whittaker lived out his remaining days in quiet obscurity, grappling with the wreckage of his choices. Stripped of his authority and alienated from his family, he was left to confront the consequences of his actions alone. Friends and allies abandoned him, unwilling to associate with a man whose name had become synonymous with corruption and bias. Even his wife, Margaret, struggled to forgive him, questioning how someone so blinded by prejudice could claim to uphold justice. Isolated and bitter, Whittaker spent hours reflecting on the lives he had destroyed, not just Marcus's but also his daughter's, and the legacy of pain he would leave behind. Though scars remained, Marcus's story offered a glimmer of hope in an often unjust world. It reminded people that while the road to redemption might be long and arduous, it is never impossible. Through perseverance and solidarity, individuals and communities could challenge entrenched systems of oppression and create a future defined by fairness and equality. And as Marcus stood before crowds, sharing his journey and inspiring others to join the fight for justice, he proved that even in the darkest moments, light could prevail, if only we have the courage to seek it. The culmination of Marcus Johnson's journey was not just a personal triumph, but a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of systemic injustice. After years of struggle, heartbreak, and unwavering determination, Marcus finally found himself standing on solid ground, ready to rebuild his life with purpose and hope. The settlement he received from his lawsuit provided more than financial compensation. It symbolized validation, a public acknowledgment that his suffering had been real, unjust, and worthy of redress. For Marcus, this moment marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where he could reclaim the dreams stolen by prejudice and incarceration. With the resources now available to him, Marcus enrolled in college, pursuing the engineering degree he had once believed was forever out of reach. Returning to academia as an adult student came with its challenges. He often felt out of place among younger classmates who hadn't experienced the hardships he endured. But Marcus approached every obstacle with grit and grace. His professors quickly recognized his brilliance, noting how his unique perspective enriched classroom discussions about innovation, ethics, and problem-solving. Inspired by his own experiences, Marcus gravitated toward projects focused on designing sustainable solutions for underserved communities. Whether developing affordable housing prototypes or creating water purification systems for rural areas, he channeled his pain into purpose, ensuring that his work would uplift others facing similar struggles. Beyond academics, Marcus became a powerful advocate for criminal justice reform. He traveled across the country, speaking at conferences, rallies, and universities, sharing his story to shed light on the pervasive inequalities within the legal system. His speeches were raw and unflinching, yet infused with compassion and optimism. "Justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoing," he often said. "It's about restoring what has been broken and believing that everyone deserves a second chance." His words resonated deeply with audiences, sparking conversations that transcended race, class, and geography. People from all walks of life reached out to thank him, telling him how his courage had inspired them to confront their own biases or take action against systemic inequities. Marcus also collaborated with grassroots organizations and policymakers to push for meaningful change. He testified before legislative committees, urging lawmakers to adopt reforms such as mandatory implicit bias training for judges and law enforcement officers, increased funding for public defenders, and the establishment of independent oversight boards to investigate claims of misconduct. His advocacy helped pass several landmark bills, earning him recognition as a leading voice in the fight for equity. Yet despite his growing influence, Marcus remained humble, always emphasizing that true progress required collective effort rather than individual heroics. Meanwhile, Emily Whittaker continued her journey of redemption, working tirelessly to make amends for the mistakes of her past. Though she could never undo the harm she had caused, she dedicated herself to honoring the memory of the young man whose life she had taken. She established a scholarship fund in his name, providing financial assistance to students pursuing careers in social justice and community development. Additionally, she volunteered at rehabilitation centers, mentoring individuals re-entering society after serving time in prison. Her commitment to these causes earned her respect from activists and critics alike, though she remained acutely aware that forgiveness, both from others and herself, would be a lifelong process. Emily's relationship with her father remained strained, a reflection of the irreparable damage caused by his actions. Judge Whittaker, now living in quiet obscurity, spent his final years grappling with regret. Stripped of his title, authority, and family ties, he was left to confront the legacy of pain he had created. Friends and former colleagues distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with a man whose name had become synonymous with corruption and bias. Even Margaret, his wife, struggled to reconcile her love for him with the knowledge of the lives he had ruined. In his solitude, Whittaker reflected on the choices that had led him down this path, wondering if he could have done things differently. Though he occasionally reached out to Emily, offering apologies and expressions of remorse, their interactions were few and fraught with tension. Ultimately, Whittaker died alone, a shadow of the man he once was, a stark reminder of how unchecked power and prejudice can destroy even those who wield them. For Marcus, however, the future brimmed with possibility. As he graduated from college with honors, surrounded by friends, mentors, and supporters who had stood by him through thick and thin, he felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the opportunities he had seized, but for the lessons he had learned along the way. He understood that while the scars of his past would always remain, they no longer defined him. Instead, they served as reminders of his strength, resilience, and capacity for growth. Looking ahead, Marcus envisioned a world where stories like his would become relics of the past, a distant memory of a time when justice was blind only in theory, not practice. He dreamed of a future where children grew up believing in the fairness of the system, where privilege didn't determine outcomes, and where accountability extended to everyone, regardless of status or background. Though he knew achieving such a vision would require relentless effort, Marcus was undeterred. He had already proven that even in the darkest moments, light could prevail, and that together, people could create a world defined by compassion, equality, and justice. In the end, Marcus's journey was not just about overcoming adversity, but about inspiring others to do the same. Through his courage, perseverance, and unwavering belief in the possibility of change, he showed that redemption is possible, even in a world riddled with flaws. And as he stepped boldly into his new beginning, Marcus carried with him the hope that his story would continue to ignite sparks of transformation, lighting the way for generations to come.